So it's quite an honor to be here. And what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to take you through, first of all, a little bit of why I research men. And of course, Joy has told you my narrative, my story of why I became interested in the relationship between sport, masculinity, and homophobia. But also, I want you to understand I do lots of other research as well. All of my research is available for free online on my website, which is ericandersonphd.com. So tonight I'm going to take you through 5 steps. First, how we learn to value sport in Western cultures, because we didn't always value competitive organized sport. Second, what I call the awful 80s, a word that I've introduced to the lexicon, homohysteria, and I'll explain that word when we get to it. Third, the body of my research that largely falls in a category that I call inclusive masculinity. And then I'm going to say how this relates to gay athletes in sports, all levels of sport. And finally, to look at how sport is beginning to lead the way in promoting anti-bullying efforts for LGBT issues, particularly in school systems. Well, no, actually, let me show you. The American football is going to represent sort of the history of where we've been, and the British football is going to represent my research and where we're at now. But let's contextualize for a moment, because Thomas Jefferson said that games played with the ball make the mind dull. What Thomas Jefferson meant was that we really shouldn't be wasting our time playing games and things of the body. We should be using our time to study the Bible. We would be better off serving our fellow countrymen and our families by working hard than we would to be wasting our time playing sport. And you have to understand that before industrialization, we didn't need sport to produce physically fit bodies. People were fit from working the farms and working, the agrarian lifestyle. So we didn't really need sport. But this all changed. We began to value sport in Western cultures because we found a unique purpose for it. We found sport became vitally important for 3 reasons. The first came in the new ways of making a living. As a product of the Industrial Revolution, men and women moved from the farms, or actually pushed out of the farms, and they moved to the cities. And in the cities, men worked predominantly, in very, very dangerous occupations, coal mining and steel and all sorts of occupations that required men to be rather stoic, that required men to take risks with their body. This is where the notion of the breadwinner was born, the masculine man who goes to work to make a living for his family. And because of that, we needed to train youth in order to be stoic, to take risks with their health. Well, what better place to do that than sport? So the capitalists could look rather generous. They could donate money to youth sporting leagues and look like they were doing some good for the community, when what they were really doing was preparing another generation of laborers to work in the factories. The second reason came in the form of a war, the Great War. And this, of course, was a horrific war where soldiers were lined up with 80 meters of mud split between them. And the British soldiers, entrenched in their dugout trenches in the mud, at the blow of a whistle, were supposed to emerge and run across the mud with their guns, shooting at the enemy. Well, many of them didn't. Many of them failed to get up. Instead, they cowardiced in the corner. And if they didn't get up, they were removed from the war, they were brought back home, they were tried for cowardice, and they were executed. Other men, they emerged from the trenches, they made it halfway across 40 meters, and they saw their brothers dying on the mud. And they realized that the bullets were heading towards them. So they would turn around and head back to their own trenches. And here they were met by bullets of their own brothers. The military realized they needed a better way to train boys to follow the orders of older men. Sport mimics the ranks, the structure, the corporal procedures of the military. Again, indoctrinating youth into this type of competitive, organized sport, male youth only, was a way of making yourself a country better equipped to fight the next war. And finally, Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychology, for all of his madness and genius, Sigmund Freud was quite interested in homosexuality, something that he called inversion. And what Sigmund Freud did, and although today sociologists and biologists, evolutionary psychologists, all agree that Sigmund Freud was wrong. But what Sigmund Freud said was that sexual orientation was something that was created as a product of one's upbringing. That the life experiences that one had made one gay or straight. Freud was not homophobic. Freud sympathized with gay men. We didn't really think there was lesbians back then. Even the Queen of England said, "Oh, don't be silly, women would never do such a thing." That's not my British accent, by the way. So Sigmund Freud wanted to sort of solve how men were being constructed as gay. And Sigmund Freud came up with this notion. And it's a notion that still sticks with us in popular culture today. Perhaps you've heard of it. In 1905, Freud wrote, "The presence of both parents plays an important part. The absence of a strong father in childhood not infrequently favors the occurrence of inversion." And by this, what Freud meant was, because the fathers had been structurally removed from their families because of industrialization, because the fathers were waking up very early in the morning and spending 12, 14 hours a day working in the industry, working in the coal mines, they were removed from the child-rearing process, that the young boys were being reared by their mothers and at school by female school teachers. They lacked the masculine vapors that were necessary to make them proper masculine men. In fact, there was a crisis in masculinity. We generally feared, turn of the 20th century, that boys were becoming wusses. My PhD advisor calls this the Great Wussification Scare. Essentially, what they were trying to do is prevent men from looking like this. And what better way to prevent men from dressing and looking like that than sport? Pierre de Coubertin started sport not to promote international goodwill. That's the myth we tell ourselves today to make us feel good about the amount of money we spend on the Olympics. Pierre de Coubertin started sport with the political aim of reversing the feminization process of British, French, American, Western men. Pierre de Coubertin instituted sport as a way to install the masculine ethos and vapors necessary. Therefore, women were banned from participation. So this is the foundation of sport in Western cultures. Well, this man was also hugely instrumental in equating femininity with homosexuality. This is the great Oscar Wilde. Britain's second most read playwright and author, Oscar Wilde was the Stephen Fry of his day. Oscar Wilde was celebrated. Oscar Wilde was amazing. Oscar Wilde still is amazing. But Oscar Wilde was accused of posing as a sodomite. Oscar Wilde was accused of homosexuality, and he was convicted. And Oscar Wilde was sentenced to 2 years hard labor, which killed 70% of those who were convicted. And Oscar Wilde, the day he was convicted, he set a trend in motion. There's a reason we call it Gay Paris today, and it's because the moment Oscar Wilde was convicted of gross indecency, the planes, the trains and boats were full of gay men fleeing England. Essentially, they knew that the microscope had been turned to them. What Oscar Wilde did for our culture was to say that homosexuality was no longer a temporary aberration. See, it used to believe that God created us all to be heterosexual, and therefore any act of homosexuality was a temporary aberration. Oscar Wilde was an immutable character. Oscar Wilde put a face on it that said, no, there is a gay species. Michel Foucault so famously said, the sodomite had been a temporary aberration. The homosexual was now a species. So we now knew what not to be like. You see, Oscar Wilde was incredibly flamboyant. He valued the aesthetic. And that set into stone what a gay man looked like. Incredibly feminine, incredibly flamboyant. And it also meant that for gay men who were in the closet, you knew what to avoid acting like in order not to be associated, not to be suspected of being gay. And this really brought us into the modern age of what I call contemporary homophobia.